Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest metro area snapshot covering the Los Angeles, California metro area. I'm Sarah Bronin, and I am really pleased to welcome you today on behalf of the whole National Zoning Atlas team. I would be remiss if I also didn't thank the foundations that have supported this work, including the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the San Francisco Foundation. We really want to thank all of our partners on the ground in California and all of those that have contributed to the California Zoning Atlas and the rest of our work nationally. With that, I'm going to just introduce our presenters and then step away to let them take it away. I may come around in the back end to answer any organizational questions, but you are going to be in more than capable hands with our three speakers today. And they represent just a few of the members of our California Zoning Atlas team. So the leader of that team, Joanna Kaufman, is a project manager. We have Sammy Yee and Anthony Law, both dual zoning and geospatial analysts. So when they talk about both sides of the project, and how analysts can read text and join them together with maps. You have two of our team members that can actually do both. We're really grateful, I should say too, that Sammy and Anthony came from a team that was formed with Professor Kat Brinkley at UC Davis. We have a number of members of her lab and folks that have worked with her. So shout out to Professor Brinkley. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna, who is going to share an overview of the presentation and take it from there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sarah. This is an overview of today's presentation. I'll introduce the atlas, why the atlas was made in the first place. Second, Anthony will then describe how it is made and some California-specific conditions we had to consider. Third, Samantha will show us how to use the atlas. Fourth, we will share some of our findings for the LA Metro, which is comprised of LA and Orange counties, and introduce our zoning snapshots feature. Lastly, I will provide some examples of the NZA in action. So, why do we need a national zoning atlas? Zoning codes are hard to read, with dizzying array of colors on local maps and a lot of confusing zoning texts. That is why the NZA exists. Simply put, the mission of the NZA is to digitize, demystify, and democratize US zoning codes. The NZA does this through its online map that standardizes information about zoning and makes it easy for people to understand. The NZA is an interactive map that shows how communities across the country zone. Here's a current screenshot of the atlas. The purple areas are places that have zoning and have been analyzed. The gray areas are places without zoning. Everything in white is to be determined. Now I'll hand it over to Anthony to explain how we make the atlas.
Thank you, Joanna. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Law, and I'm a zoning and geospatial analyst with the NZA. I've analyzed zoning across a number of states, mainly focusing on California, and I'll be describing how the atlas is created through zoning and geospatial analysis. Starting with our zoning analysis, this begins with identifying jurisdictions, which are the cities, towns, counties, villages, and townships that have zoning authority. Within just the Los Angeles metro area, we found 124 individual jurisdictions that have the right to exercise zoning, a small sample of which can be seen on the right. Once each zone jurisdiction has been identified, we then analyze the zoning districts that belong to each one and their different rules. For reference, here is a screenshot of 19 zoning districts as they appear in the NZA editor. On the left are the district names, and you can see on the right that districts can be classified as primarily residential, mixed with residential, or non-residential. These are all base districts, meaning they're the base classification on the map, but many jurisdictions have overlays, which are separate districts that are stacked on top of one or more base districts to provide additional regulations, sometimes more strict, sometimes more lenient, depending on the objective of that overlay. When we are able to identify that a jurisdiction has zoning, we can then collect two main components of a complete zoning code, the zoning text and the zoning map. Both text and map are necessary because while the ordinance ordinance text contains a lot of critical information, we also need to know how much land is allocated to each district and how they're distributed throughout the jurisdiction. Here you can see the images of the text and map we used for our analysis of Hermosa Beach. Now, after collecting the map and code, NZA team members then complete 2 work streams per jurisdiction, the text analysis and the geospatial analysis. The text analyst breaks down the zoning code, then specifies a list of districts and systematically logs key data points using the NZA's standardized methodology. The geospatial analyst obtains a zoning map, specifies its zoning districts, and depending on the available format, either digitizes a static PDF map or standardizes existing geospatial data. The product of both work streams are then joined and integrated together into the NZA as the final product. Now that we understand the basics of how the atlas is populated with zoning data, I'd like to discuss some factors unique to California. First is the introduction of coastal zones, which are specifically broken down into 3 jurisdictions: non-appealable, appealable, and original coastal commission permit. In these areas, a coastal development permit is required, and the approving body will vary. In cases like these, where all 3 areas are shown, we will map these separately, given that they have differing procedural requirements. In the scenario that the code does not establish different procedures for these jurisdictions, then they are mapped together with a visible atlas note describing why. It is also important to note that these areas likely require public hearings for the coastal development permits to be approved, but their uses will be marked as overlay on the atlas with a note stating that public hearing will be required. This is due to the large variety of districts that coastal zones cover, and this method will allow us to best avoid skewing data points. Moving on, it is also common for both planned developments and specific plans to appear in California, as they are both tools for allowing flexible site-specific zoning to accommodate unique development goals. For either to be incorporated, they must first be a part of the zoning text or adopted by reference. If they are not, then they will not be entered into the atlas. In many cases, these developments will create sub-districts. For these to be incorporated into the atlas, they must be mapped by the jurisdiction and be significantly different in terms of permitted uses or development standards. We also want to note that while the California Environmental Quality Act has significant impact in the development process, we do not factor it in unless the provisions are directly integrated into zoning regulations. This is again because we are only analyzing what can be found in the zoning text. With that being said, I will pass it to Samantha.
Thank you, Anthony. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha, and I'm a zoning and geospatial analyst with the NZA. I'm currently analyzing data in the central coast of California, but I've worked on Colorado and other parts of California in the past. We're now going to walk through how to use the interactive map and get the most out of its features. To follow along with me, you should head to zoningatlas.org/atlas. You can use a computer or mobile phone, but know the size of the map will be different for both. While you get set up, I'll share the view of the map again at the national scale, which includes Alaska and Hawaii. The colored in areas indicate our total progress. You can see that we have 12 states plus DC completely integrated into the atlas. California, Utah, and North Carolina are nearing completion, and many major metro areas are completed, including several in Texas, Tennessee, and New York State. These published areas add up to over 8,000 jurisdictions. About 2/3 of these jurisdictions are confirmed to have zoning, and we have confirmed that the remaining third do not have zoning. Within the zone jurisdictions, we've analyzed and published over 88,000 zoning districts, and our analysts have read over 925,000 pages of zoning codes. These places are home to more than half of the nation's residents and cover over half of its total land. Now let's dive into the interactive map. The map opens at the national scale where the legend reflects the zone status of the jurisdictions in purple and gray. The areas shown in white are yet to be analyzed and integrated into the NZA. If you have the tribal land and protected land layers on, you will also see these green and green-brown layers. This is most visible in the western states. In the legend and layers options box in the upper left corner, you have a few options to toggle on and off additional layers and features. You can also change the base map here. Now we'll use the zoom and filter box to explore a chosen geography. We selected California in the state dropdown and the map zoomed to that state. We have the option to be even more specific with our geography selection. We selected Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim in the metro micropolitan area dropdown. Then we selected Los Angeles County in the county dropdown and Los Angeles in the jurisdiction dropdown. The map zoomed to the city of Los Angeles and outlined the jurisdiction in black. Please note that you can only select one jurisdiction at a time. At this scale, notice that the legend updates to show zoning district type. Light purple areas indicate primarily residential districts, meaning these districts are primarily zoned for residential uses. Dark purple areas indicate mixed with residential districts, meaning these districts allow a mix of residential and non-residential uses. Tan areas indicate non-residential districts, meaning residential as a primary use is prohibited. These are typically zones allowing industrial uses or other non-residential uses like airports or open space. Now let's apply filters to the map. The Show Me Where People Can Build box has options for quick filtering, like to show where missing middle housing or apartments are allowed. We toggled on the single-family homes filter, and you can see the map lost some color. Areas remain colored in when their criteria satisfies the selected filters. In other words, this means you can build a single-family home anywhere the map is light or dark purple. In the lower right corner, the filtering results box calculates the zoned acres and number of districts that satisfy the filtering criteria. According to these results, 75% of zoned acres in Los Angeles allow single-family housing by right. Note that the filtering results only show calculations for the single selected jurisdiction. Now let's look at the Advanced Filters box. You should use it for selecting more specific filtering criteria, like whether 1, 2, 3, or 4+ unit housing is also subject to a public hearing, minimum parking requirements, or height caps, among other options. We've selected criteria where 4+ family housing is allowed as of right and has a minimum parking requirement. According to the filtering results, 21% of zoned acres in Los Angeles satisfy this criteria.
All right, so you've learned a bit about the map. Now let's see how the Los Angeles metro zones. We're going to focus in the first part of this presentation about the statistics relevant to the whole Los Angeles metro area or census-based statistical area. For short, we'll refer to this as a CBSA. These numbers will give you a sense of how these different zoning codes come together across the metro. In all jurisdictions with zoning, we analyzed over 45,000 pages of zoning code, and we logged up to 200 data points for each of the 4,020 districts that make up the zone land of the metro. This is more voluminous zoning codes than we see in some states. All 124 jurisdictions in the CBSA have zoning. Now, to break down the share of land categories across the CBSA, 35% of the CBSA is designated as protected land, and another 8% is unzoned, which is all the gray area in the previous map. This leaves 57% of the metro's land subject to zoning. I should note that by population, this is the second largest CBSA in the US after the New York City CBSA with over 12 million residents. Of this zone land, 85% allows for residential development. And if you remember, residential development occurs in districts that we identify as either primarily residential or mixed with residential. 15% of land doesn't allow residential development. This could be because it's industrial only or maybe conservation land. This table shows the share of residential land designated for different types of housing. From left to right, there are columns for 1, 2, and 4 or more family housing. The darker blue shows that housing is allowed by right. The lighter blue requires approvals which necessitate a public hearing, and gray is prohibited. By land area, 81% of land allowing residential development allows 1 unit per lot by right. That means single-family housing can be built almost anywhere in the CBSA. Now compare this to the 28% of land allowing 2 units by right. The next column shows that 10% of residential land allows 3 units, and finally 9% of land allows 4 or more units by right. If a planned development or specific plan area is not incorporated into the zoning text, we have to make some generalizations on the residential uses allowed and the approvals required to establish the planned development or specific plan. Per our analysis, large swaths of the CBSA still prohibit multifamily housing, which impacts housing supply and affordability. Now I'll hand it back over to Anthony to talk about our findings for minimum lot sizes.
Thank you, Joanna. Now looking a bit deeper into the zoning data shown by this donut chart, we can see how single-family zone land breaks down by minimum lot size requirements. The darker the green, the larger the required lot size. The donut shows that 4% of single-family land requires a lot size between 40,000 and 80,000 square feet, and a full 41% of single-family land in the LA metro area, in the darkest green, requires a minimum lot size of 80,000 square feet or more. Put simply, approximately half of single-family land requires lots of at least 40,000 square feet, which is about an acre, but most of that land actually calls for closer to 2 acres at least. This is a massive land requirement for just one home. Smaller lot sizes are much less common, and notice the hatched part on the top of the donut. This shows that 14% of land has lot size mandates that vary. We've logged how they vary, but for the purposes of this chart, consider that this zone land in the LA metro area has more complicated requirements than a simple number. Now let's discuss another type of housing that's become quite popular in a lot of states over the past few years. That's the accessory dwelling unit, or the ADU. This is sometimes called the granny flat or the in-law suite, but an ADU, as we will call it, is a second home built on the same lot as a single-family home. In California, state law actually requires that local governments allow ADUs, which means that we expected to find that most jurisdictions allowed them. And in fact, we did. According to our analysis, 95% of single-family zone land in the LA metro area allows ADUs by right, shown here in the dark orange. And 2% prohibits ADUs, as seen in the light gray. Now the lighter orange, along the top of the donut, represents 2% of land that allows ADUs with occupancy restrictions. Examples of these restrictions include mandating owner occupancy, prohibiting ADU rentals, or requiring the ADU tenant to be a relative, employee, or elderly occupant. It may be that some of these jurisdictions are not compliant with state statutes. That is something to explore further. And finally, 90% of residential land in the LA metro area imposes parking mandates. These are rules that require a minimum number of parking spaces for each new home. These two maps show the prevalence of parking mandates, with the purple map on the left highlighting that essentially all residential land requires parking. And in sharp contrast, the white map on the right shows those few purple spots in the region that do not require parking. We know that this is changing. The recent LA downtown zoning update removed parking requirements within its boundaries, decreasing the amount of mandated parking. Now, parking might seem like a minor concern to some, but it's a costly use of valuable land and an important regulation to track because those extra costs can end up deterring new housing. Now I'll pass it to Samantha.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce a tool provided by the NZA called zoning snapshots. A zoning snapshot is a visual statistical summary of any jurisdiction, county, or metro micropolitan area published to the NZA. We'll now show how they look. Here you see snapshots for the city of Anaheim, Orange County, and the LA Long Beach Anaheim metro area. With zoning snapshots, you can easily review key zoning statistics for jurisdictions. For example, at a glance, you can see that the city of Anaheim shows more permissive treatment of multifamily housing than the county as a whole. You can generate your own zoning snapshots by going to zoningatlas.org/snapshots. Or if you're exploring on the atlas itself and have a jurisdiction selected, you can scroll down from the map to access buttons that take you to the snapshots. Now, using the snapshots, we've chosen a range of jurisdictions to highlight a few different types of housing contexts within the LA metro area. Los Angeles and Anaheim, the largest cities by population in LA and Orange counties respectively, both adopt a more permissive treatment to multifamily housing. I would point you to the dark blue in these columns, which shows where housing is allowed by right. Like before, the columns are 1, 2, 3, and 4 or more family zoning. In these 4 cities, LA allows for 23% and Anaheim allows for 29% of 4+ family housing by right, compared to just 9% across the broader CBSA. Huntington Beach is a city that has been in the news for being sued by the state for noncompliance with state regional housing needs assessment requirements. This is reflected in their code, as all 4+ family housing requires a public hearing. Bradbury is almost exclusively single-family housing. The jurisdiction primarily consists of 2 gated communities. We also want to emphasize the diversity of land use contexts within the CBSA, which includes high-density urbanized areas, lower-density suburban neighborhoods, and agricultural areas. Here, we've selected 2 cities that have different approaches to zoning. For example, Santa Monica exemplifies a highly urbanized area, characterized by the high amount of mixed-use land. That's the purple chart at the top, the darker purple showing the mixed-use areas. If you look at the chart just below, you can see that it allows multifamily housing in a lot of its land, but subjects all of it to a public hearing. In contrast, Rancho Palos Verdes has less mixed-use land. It also represents a lower density suburban area. If you look at the second chart here, you can see that the zoning predominantly allows single-family and duplex residential housing. Virtually no land permits housing over 3 units. La Habra Heights represents an even more suburbanized context, only permitting single-family housing. There is no mixed-use land, which would have been represented in dark purple at the top graphic. Unincorporated LA County is also noteworthy, as it encompasses a large part of the LA CBSA. And here there is a larger amount of mixed-use land. However, like La Habra Heights, most of the residential land in this jurisdiction permits single-family housing, and there is only a tiny amount of land allowing for multifamily housing, either by right or after a public hearing.
To conclude this section, we want to acknowledge that California has passed many statewide housing regulations intended to increase the supply and affordability of housing. Some of the topics of the laws are included in this slide: split lots, approval types, accessory dwellings, and more. We want to emphasize that we only log what is in the zoning codes. We do not currently show on the public map any state requirements that are not codified as part of the zoning text. If you have questions about the way we've incorporated local updates, then we refer to our methodology. For example, if a state law requires local governments to allow a second unit, we may have logged the new local rules as allowing 2 family units in some cases or as ADUs in other cases. That's because we analyze the words local government uses. Finally, we want to say that outside of California, we have been fortunate to be able to take the information we've collected and use it for advocacy, analysis, and research. In the advocacy context, we work with advocates across the political spectrum on zoning data. In 2025, we used our data in Texas to analyze the impacts of a proposed bill on manufactured housing on zoning conditions in around 600 Texas communities. That legislation passed along with many other pro-home bills in Texas. In 2025, the NZA research team produced a comprehensive analysis of zoning conditions for the entire state of Colorado. The NZA found that the vast majority of zoned land in Colorado favors single-family housing. Surprisingly, the report shows that 86% of single-family zoning requires a minimum lot size of 2 acres. This is in a state celebrated for the preservation of its natural environment. Finally, the NZA, in partnership with the Planning and Research Organization, Regional Plan Association, released a report on the links between zoning and climate resiliency. The team found that in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester counties, current zoning is allowing housing to be built in areas subject to sea level rise. Many of these homes will be lost in the coming decades, adding to the region's housing needs. The report also found that codes allow less than half of the total housing that will be needed by 2040 to meet the region's housing needs. The report urges state and local policymakers to consider zoning for more housing in areas that are on higher ground. The NZA is a powerful tool, but it shines when people use it to power their own research and advocacy. Use the NZA and publicly share what you find. You can reach out to the team at info@zoningatlas.org and follow NZA socials for the latest NZA news and events. And with that, I'll open it up for some questions. I'll give a second here in case anyone wants to drop something.
Joanna, if I might just ask maybe Anthony and Sammy to talk about how easy it was to get the codes. And I know maybe Anthony has worked in some other states, but maybe more so, maybe comparing the availability of codes and information about maps to other states, just to get the queue going.
Yeah, I would say that for this area, I personally found that codes were mostly accessible on the jurisdiction website. There were, however, some smaller jurisdictions that either the website was not updated, making it harder to find the code, so I had to dig around a little bit more. But I'd say overall, for me, pretty good.
Yeah, I also wanted to add a lot of jurisdictions in this area have GIS data readily available, which is something that I didn't really see working in Colorado, where you would typically just have a code and a PDF map. So that made editing the data a little bit easier on our part, especially because a lot of these jurisdictions have a lot more zoning districts compared to smaller areas. And yeah.
I might also ask if you guys don't mind, because I know I've been watching the project develop, how, if you could say a little bit more about the coastal zoning issue. Because I think that that's been an issue in some of the states. So as you know, we've been working recently in Maine, and so we have that sort of dual layer of local zoning and shore land zoning there. But how does coastal zoning work in California, and how did that challenge you as an analyst in terms of how you documented those special zones?
I can start. So I'd say it really varies between jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions will have an entirely separate coastal zoning code. So it's like a completely separate title. Some districts will just have one coastal overlay that goes over the entire city. Some places won't mention coastal zoning at all, and we'll have to add in the coastal overlay ourselves based on the given coastal boundary on the California Commission's website. And so, yeah, I'd say it really varies. Typically in the coastal zones, there will be a requirement for those coastal development permits, as you mentioned. But it really varies between each jurisdiction. And so just making sure we track all of that has been kind of a challenge, yes.
Yeah, I also want to say, as Sammy mentioned, sometimes the coastal code is not is outside of the zoning text, and that can make it hard to find because a lot of times those can be a bit outdated. The ones I've seen have been a bit older, as you can tell because it's a scanned PDF, not like a modern PDF that we usually use. And in cases that we do find it in the zoning code, it can be kind of hard to interpret the differing procedures for each different area, especially it's just very vague a lot of times, as you might expect. So it can be very complicated.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in there before we did get a question in the Q&A, which I'll read in a second. But something we haven't really touched on yet is we've discovered a lot of discrepancies between zoning maps and the zoning text, and that's something that we have to navigate. And there are certain times we find that with coastal zones, even if there's a separate coastal zoning map, that there are times that they are in conflict with the base zoning map. So that's something else we have to navigate. And actually, I will say California has less confusion over this than Maine. Maine has shoreland zoning, and we found that the Maine zoning maps in particular were honestly kind of a nightmare to deal with, but I'm not here to bag on Maine. We're here to talk about the LA Metro. So I just want to share that. And now I'll jump into a question that we got. Thank you very much for the presentation. One of the big pieces of land use news at the moment is SB 79, the Abundant and Affordable Housing Near Transit Act, which is on the governor's desk for signature. I'm curious if you all have investigated the potential impact across California's urban areas. I want to take a stab at answering that first, and anyone else is welcome to jump in. But what we do, we take a look at the zoning as a snapshot in time. And so this hasn't been signed into law yet. So it still hasn't been incorporated into the zoning text. So once it is incorporated into zoning text and adopted and the zoning codes are then updated, we will then take a look. And so we're still, as you can imagine, zoning codes are changing all the time, especially in California as new state laws get passed. So this is something that we'll be working on having the means to continually update the map. We already have a process of how we do that. But as you imagine, it takes some labor to do. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add in.
Maybe I'll just add, since earlier today we had another group of analysts who were speaking to local planners that were in the Boston area. Those jurisdictions around Boston were recently required to update their zoning codes pursuant to the MBTA Communities Act. And what we are doing there, exactly as Joanna said, is we are taking so we had already logged the underlying zoning conditions for Massachusetts. Now our team is logging the updates as jurisdictions are submitting them to the state and receiving approval for upzonings around transit. So we've done that in Massachusetts. We hope that this bill is signed and we can do that too in California. We are going to be launching as soon as we complete the state, and I think we have about 9 or 10% left. We will be launching a full state update. So we will sweep those updates into that 2025-2026 round of updates. I'll just mention one more thing too, which is that on the map itself, so when the team showed the map, you saw those little white circles showing the transit stops. Already, if you're interested now in seeing what the zoning conditions around the transit stops that will be subject to rezonings under SB 79, you can look at conditions now. So we have that layer, the transit stations layer, thanks to Yona Freemark. So we are hope that it'll get use in Massachusetts and use here in the LA region and throughout California.
I'm not sure how we are on time, but we have another question. I really enjoyed the presentation. I would like to piggyback on Sarah's question and Anthony's response. I remember it was hard to find data and municipal codes for smaller jurisdictions. How did you manage to include the data for these smaller jurisdictions? I know Anthony or Sammy, if you want to talk about the process of obtaining zoning codes and zoning maps for these smaller jurisdictions.
Yeah, so I'll just start like the normal process as we go through it is we search it online, and hopefully on the jurisdiction's website will be a clear link to the zoning code and the zoning map. In cases where this does not happen, our next process is to reach out to the jurisdiction themselves through email, and if email does not work, we will call them. And in the cases that these levels of process do not work, we will mark that a jurisdiction after diligent search does not, we're unable to find the materials. Sammy, I don't know if you have more to add to that. I sped from that a little bit.
No, yeah, that was a really good summary. I can think of one example. It's not within the LA CVSA, but Canyon Lake has their zoning code up on their website, but it's a little outdated and parts of it are incomplete. There's not the typical sections that include the administrative processes. It's not included in the zoning code, but there is a zoning map. So in that case, we would map the zoning map and mark those districts as extinct and log, as Anthony said, has zoning but incomplete after diligent search.
I do just want to add that one reason that the person asking the question was familiar with the difficulty in obtaining municipal codes is because they were part of our team that had started work in California through the Othering and Belonging Institute, the group that's led by Dr. Stephen Menendian and Samira Gambier. So thanks for that question. And we continue to feel the pain, although more so in other jurisdictions than in California, fortunately.
We have another question. The comparisons you shared within the metro area are interesting, especially in regards to how little multifamily housing some allow. What do you think the implications are when some allow a diversity of housing types and some don't? I could take a stab at answering that if Sammy or Anthony, if you don't want to jump in first. I'll jump in since you answered the last one. So some of the implications, especially across a broad metro area like LA, is if you don't have a wide variety of housing types, like multifamily housing in certain areas, if it's just single family, it may impact the affordability, and it may limit the diversity of populations that may be able to locate in certain areas, especially if these are areas closer to job centers. And then conversely, what we see a lot in Southern California, we didn't really talk about we were looking solely at the CVSA, but really the LA Metro, it spans across a pretty wide region. And you end up seeing some people that may want to live in single family housing being pushed out in ex-urban areas, kind of like Riverside County or San Bernardino County or Ventura County, and they're still commuting to job centers in LA County, which obviously the LA Metro, very well known for its traffic. So those are a couple of implications that I could think of, are some of the implications of limiting multifamily housing, especially with the example like Sammy gave of La Habra Heights and Bradbury, both more exclusive areas, but limited housing options for people that may be working in those areas.
Yeah, I'd like to add on just like one more point. When there's like a lack of diverse housing options, also relating to the first question about SB 79, a lack of diverse housing options can reduce the effectiveness of transit or reduce the possible level of ridership, which is why SB 79 is definitely interesting to see where it will go.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. I think with that, we will go ahead and probably call it, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.